Good morning. It is 9:40 a.m. on Sunday, October 13th, 2019. I'm Christiana Ellis and I just got up. This is 5 more minutes. So, because it is Sunday and this is what I do on Sundays, I'm continuing my rewatch of Cowboy Bebop this week with session 5, Ballad of Fallen Angels. Now we get some Spike backstory. In the very first episode, we got a few very cryptic hints, just a few images of Spike, getting in, carrying a bouquet of roses that's actually a cover for a gun and getting into some sort of a fight that is similar but not the same as the one that happens in this episode. But we see a bit more clips back and forth to suggest that, there is some parallel things going on. It all kind of evokes a sort of cyclic destiny sort of feel with Spike. But so we begin in this episode seeing what it is apparently the heads of two crime families negotiating a truce. And they're both in agreement that okay, the fighting is too much. We've got to calm it all down, and we can get back to business, that sort of thing. They seem like they're in agreement, but then as one of the groups is leaving and the other guy's watching from the window, he watches and sees the other ship blow up, and he's like, "What?" So it's clearly the sort of thing where we could imagine, oh no, he's betrayed them, except that he seems surprised also. This is where we get our first introduction to Vicious, who is, it's interesting. We'll obviously be talking more about Vicious as the series progresses, but my vague feeling about him, based on previous viewings of the show, is that Vicious is not an especially compelling character in and of himself, right? Like, he's kind of just one of those like edgy, like, ooh, he's so dark and scary, ooh yeah, that sort of character. But what does make him interesting is purely as a foil for Spike. He's sort of like just this, a little bit like Belloc for Indiana Jones in Raiders of the Lost Ark. It's this idea of there once was more similarity between the two of them, but they've made different choices since, and that's why Spike is who he is now, and why Vicious who he is now, and we like Spike more, for sure. But just, yeah, Vicious kind of, as I recall from previous viewings, feels kind of one note. But he does get some cool moments just by virtue of the plot deciding he gets to always be one step ahead of everybody. Certainly in this moment, there's some cool reveals in that sense. But so Vicious shows up, and he kills everybody there. He's apparently killing everybody on both sides of this truce negotiation. But the leader here that we see here, Mao Yenrai, does know him. So the indication is, oh, this is someone who works for him, who is now, performing a coup because presumably he doesn't like this truce, I guess. Right? That's what we're understanding as we see this. But what we also see, though, is just before he's killed, this leader, this now deposed leader, says this would never happen if Spike were still here. Boom, boom, boom. But so then we cut to the Bebop, and we have Jet and Spike. And I love that it kind of just, it cuts right into the middle. There's where we don't start the scene at the beginning. We just jump right into where Jet and Spike have both seen that there's now a big, big bounty for Mao Yenrai. And they both seem to have already gotten to the point where they don't know how to continue the conversation, because essentially Spike is they both know something's up with this, right? This is extremely suspicious. Jet understands that there's some sort of a connection with Spike, and that this is like it's a trap, possibly even just like specifically a trap for Spike personally. But yet he understands Spike is absolutely going to pursue this. I hope I can talk him out of it. But and he's demanding from Spike more information, like what is going on here? What is this guy to you? And Spike, as a deflection, says, well, yeah, so how did you lose your arm? And at this point, at least, Jet doesn't answer. And at this point, we have, Faye shows up and she's still hanging out, wanting to say, hey, what are we doing today? And Jet tells her, mind your own business. Stuff's still going on with Spike. Spike's leaving. Jet is saying, well, yeah, fine, but if, I can't be responsible. And Spike's like, yeah, fine, yeah, okay. And it's totally like, poor Jet, he's the mom. He's the ship mom. And it's so adorable. I like Jet so much when he's in mom mode. Like, he wants to protect his friends, but he doesn't know what to do. Aw, poor Jet. Anyway, because Spike's going to do what Spike's going to do. Like, whoever can control Spike, right? Well, that's a question we might, see more about in future as we continue through the series. But in the meantime, it's frustrating to Jet because he understands there's something deeply personal about this with Spike. But he doesn't fully understand it and can't seem to talk Spike out of it, and he's not sure what to do. Meanwhile, Faye is just stumbling in. She doesn't have a sense of any of this baggage. She just sees a big payday and she's like, oh, well, so I think I'll take advantage of this lead that I just heard about and let's go after this guy. And so this is where we get some cool stuff with Faye. On the one hand, seeing more of how she approaches these things. Namely, she gets all glammed up in a fancy dress and then just basically decides to pass herself off as, oh, I'm Mao's date. And that's why you're going to let me go up there. But then when she gets up there, she finds out that, like, wait, they're expecting me? Oh, shoot, they really know my real name. They've done research on me. And then they sit her next to this guy in the opera box, and he's dead. And so she's very quickly realizing she is in way over her head. And it's definitely, even though this whole idea of, Vicious as a character trait being one step ahead of everybody all the time, like, that's, I mean, they don't show him doing any of the work, right? Like, how is he always able to do that? How did he know to research Faye and do all of that ahead of time? Like, it doesn't really matter, but it's one of the things that I think it's cool, but it's kind of a shallow characterization, but it is cool. So that, that whole opera scene is very cool. And I've actually read that there's a big homage to Marathon Man in that scene, I guess, which has a similar scene at an opera box. I've actually not seen Marathon Man. That maybe is a gap in my cinematic history that I should fill. Anyway, so she is now taken prisoner, meets Vicious. Vicious. But in the meantime, Spike is pursuing all of this by going to visit an old friend named Annie. And I like that, Cowboy Bebop as a whole show kind of veers back and forth in terms of, like, how progressive it is in certain things. For example, just like as we had in the past, this idea that people are sort of just casually getting cosmetic surgery to make themselves look like ethnic stereotypes and that sort of thing, when they're trying to evade the law. It's not always the most sensitive in that regard, but it is pretty cool having Spike's old ally here be a heavy-set middle-aged woman, and who's not just the badass. She's badass in the way that a heavy-set middle-aged woman who's very confident in herself and has no more fucks to give is. And that's very cool, but they don't have to just make her into like a cliche. It's kind of cool, and so that's fun. And so what we see first is that she's just running the equivalent of a convenience store. Some kids are trying to steal porno mags, and she's chasing them down when she runs into Spike, and she is shocked because, as we learn, she thought he died 3 years ago. So she clearly knows him. They have a history, and she is really conflicted now because on the one hand, they apparently liked each other before, and so the fact that he's not dead would seem like something that's good, like she's glad to see him, except that what she knows is for him to show up again asking about Vicious means that, like, is he really alive or is he just still moving? Which is certainly a, not in a literal sense, obviously, but like he seems determined to, get himself killed for real this time. And that is kind of a sad feeling for her. And especially given that she's already sad by saying that essentially that, Mao is already dead, who is also a common, ally between them. And she seems, basically she doesn't know that she can do anything. It's a little bit like poor Jet in the sense of like Spike is determined to do what he's going to do. He has no mental defenses against Vicious. Like Vicious's pull on him goes right to the core of him, and he can't. We don't really understand why that is yet, but we can see everyone trying to tell him that it's not a good idea, and yet he's going to do it anyway. And there's some nice stuff about we see her, basically just even having this conversation, just leading her to drink pretty heavily, and he's, trying to say, hey, you should slow down. It's good for your health. And she's just like, what are you talking about? You're the one that's going to rush into a fight here. And then there's just a nice moment where she's going to drink another one for Mao. And he says, well, if it's for Mao, then I'll drink it. And because he's worried about her and they like each other. And it's just a lovely little scene there, even as there's this feeling of doom hanging over it. In the meantime, we also have, this is where, Spike, now knowing a bit more about what's going on and that Vicious is involved, we see him go back to the Bebop to get more weapons. And so Jet has been doing some research of his own. He tells him what we already know, which is that Mao is already dead. It's definitely a trap. And Spike's saying, I know that, but it's not one that I can ignore. And this is where we have Jet kind of start trying to, like, he's doing anything he can think of to try to protect his friend here. He tries to say, you asked about my arm, which we saw earlier he wouldn't answer because it's obviously very personal. And of course, we will learn more about his arm in a future episode. But, he basically says, I wouldn't answer you before. I'll answer you now. I lost it by being headstrong like you're being. And he's trying to relate to Spike, hoping to make a dent. And then it's just not getting anywhere. And then we have a video message from Faye, who is prisoner. And it's just, as though Spike were not already on his way. Vicious is just doing everything he can to bait him. And says, yeah, they want you to come here. And Jet is frustrated and furious. They're still not close with Faye the way they are to each other. So, Jet is encouraging him to say, like, leave her. She got herself into her own mess against my advice. And Spike basically tells her he's coming, but, says to Jet that it's not for her. In the meantime, we get the big cathedral fight. There's a moment where Vicious is there, Spike shows up. Um, it's clear phase hostage, but then it was always going to be a fight. So, Spike does kind of the badass thing where the first bullet fired goes right into the forehead of the guy who had a gun at Faye's head, killing him and letting her sort of be free to run away, which she does. Good for her. Um, with her hand in a fancy dress and with her hands handcuffed behind her back, there's not a lot else she could have done, even if she wanted to. Um, so in the meantime, we get this cool fight that seems really dire, especially where lots of people getting killed, but then we also see we see Spike get shot to the gut, and not by Vicious, but just by one of the random thugs, is that he's fighting his way through. And he keeps going, but it's already feeling really like, oh God, this is really bad. And we get to the two of them, where it's just the two of them left, and they're fighting each other, but they're so evenly matched. Even though we got Vicious with his sword and Spike with his gun, and we're certainly seeing some, like the John Wick movies clearly drew some inspiration from some of this stuff. And they're dueling, and they get to a brief stalemate, and we get a great exchange of Spike, do you know what your face looks like right now? What? A ravenous beast. The same blood runs in you and me, the blood of a beast who wanders, desiring the blood of others. And then Spike says, I've bled all that blood away. Then why are you still alive? Bah! It's super edgy, with Hot Topic style edgy, right? But it's great, and it's so heightened compared to what's cool about Spike as a character is that most of the time he really acts like he doesn't take things very seriously. He's very glib about most things. He's very casual about danger because he can handle it. But we can also see how intense he gets for the things that do actually matter to him, which just gives this glibness that he has most of the time its own weight, because he's kind of haunted by the stuff that really matters to him, right? It's not that he doesn't take anything seriously. It's that he's this baggage that he's carrying from his past is so heavy that it just makes everything else in life seem light by comparison. And so that's cool. So even though Vicious is kind of a one-note character, Spike is not. And that's where the contrast comes, and that's interesting. So even though I don't think Vicious is interesting in his own right, I wouldn't care about a Vicious standalone story. He is cool in terms of what he means for Spike's character. So the two of them are, fighting. It seems really dire. After the stalemate, Spike gets thrown out this window. He's already wounded. He's flying out this broken window backwards, falling, several stories down to stone steps. It seems like, oh my God, how could anyone survive that? But as he's thrown out the window, we see that he manages to leave a grenade behind. So it seems like, has this been a stalemate for the two of them where they both kill each other? It seems like what it would be. And as he's falling, we see him remembering more, and we get more of the imagery that we opened the series with, but also more stuff of indications that there's this blonde woman. And I don't think we've actually got her name yet in this episode, but we see this blonde woman who's clearly an associate of theirs. We see Spike and Vicious fighting together, not with each other, but, on the same side, they've got each other's back, like comrades. And then we see this woman who, we get a brief shot of her in bed with Vicious, but when we also see, Spike with some longing looks, being under her window with the bouquet of roses that we know also contains a gun. She's clearly tearing up some sort of a letter and tossing the pieces out the window, and them floating down is matched with the broken glass floating down. There's some very cool stuff in there. And then there's a moment where he remembers being very wounded after some previous fight and being cared for by this woman who's kind of humming, and it's clearly a very positive memory for him. But then we see him wake up on the Bebop, and he's clearly very wounded. The show kind of brushes over how could he have actually survived the fall by saying, well, he survived, but he's very wounded, and now he's being cared for. But how did they manage to get him out? Where did he get treatment? Like, this stuff's not really important, so they just skip over it. So we have Spike having this memory of being cared for when injured before, and now it's sort of combined with the current status of where he's being cared for on the Bebop, but now it's actually Faye who's humming. And so when she sees he's awake, she comes over and she's being pretty nice and gentle with him, because I think the fact that even if, regardless of whether it was for her or not, he definitely saved her life by coming there, right? And by killing the guy who had her hostage allowed her to get away. So she does owe him her life, really. And so she's kind of being gentle and affectionate. But in the meantime, all he wants to tell her as he draws her close is that she's humming off key. So she hits him with a pillow, and we get the the comic relief to finish that tense finish. But so we get some Spike backstory, but there's clearly a lot of imagery evoking more to this. We know that who's Vicious to Spike, right? He is a former ally in a crime family that Spike was also previously part of. There's clearly a woman who is involved somehow, because we see her in a nice, just sort of a homey dress taking care of him in a house, but we also see her in a badass leather bodysuit with a weapon. So she's clearly not just some random woman. But what's her deal? What is Julia's deal? Even though I don't think we could get her name yet in this episode. But so we get hints of the backstory, a little bit of it, but clearly it will need to continue to unfold as the series progresses. So next time we get another one of the kind of standalone episodes, but it's got some interesting stuff in it. We'll be talking about Sympathy for the Devil, and that'll be next week. And so in the meantime, I'll talk to you tomorrow for 5 more minutes.